So welcome everyone. My name is Cheryl Boes, and I am going to be spending the next hour or so talking a little bit about STEM and project-based learning and how those two things work together. I will spend a little bit of time telling you about my role in Michigan. I work with primary age students, ages 5 to 12 years old, and my school has about 500 students. I work in the library, so what that means is each student visits the library once per week, and they come to the library to visit our makerspace. They come to visit and check out a library book. We work on different projects with basic computer science and coding. So the library really is the center of the school for students and teachers and families. So this is just a little window into what my library looks like today. It's very empty right now because our schools closed on March 13th and students and teachers did not go back to school. So I just received a message today that we are welcome to come back to school tomorrow, and we can start putting together our learning space. We are going to be welcoming our students in a remote setting for remote learning until November. But after November, then our plan is to transition back to face-to-face learning. And so I hope that this space will be filled with, lots of students and teachers.
Fingers crossed.
Yes, fingers crossed. Yes, I hope so. So I'm curious. I could see we had about 25, I think, participants. So I'm curious what today's audience looks like for me. Are you primary or secondary teachers? What subject areas do you teach? My role has evolved I've been an educator for over 20 years. And so I've done staff development, meaning that I teach teachers in a professional setting. I've worked as a classroom teacher, but the last, I think, 15 years, because I can gauge that on my son is 15 years old. I started working in the media center about 15 years ago. So that's where my role has been for the last 15 years. And it's been a great place for integrating projects and STEM principles. So who do we have in our audience today? So project-based learning, that model really sets the stage for STEM projects because they can have a community impact that goes beyond the school. And it does take a little bit of extra planning on the teacher's side, but that extra planning and thought that goes into the project that relates to the STEM principles is going to pay off when you have your students working engaged and working independently and excited about the project. So, as I said, our STEM projects, the most effective ones are problem-based. And so just one example, in the school that I work in, a group of students had noticed a problem in our lunchroom or in our cafeteria. We had an overabundance of waste when it came to food-related waste in our cafeteria. So the students worked together with their teachers. They worked with the principal, with the cook that was in the cafeteria, and some community members. And in the end result was these students worked to create a compost area for our school. And so the students had to educate their classmates and their friends about what items were appropriate for a compost. So those would be food scraps and fruit and vegetable-based things. And so we didn't want to have students putting any sort of waste like paper or plastic or those types of things to our compost. And so the end result from these students realizing the amount of waste that we had in our cafeteria was that we have a compost now that is providing very rich soil that we can be using on our school grounds. So what I would challenge you to do is talk with your students and think about what are some problems that they recognize within the school. What are possibly some problems that are in the community that they could start brainstorming and coming up with ideas on how to solve these problems. And in the process of doing that, they're using those STEM principles. So many teachers and students find the engineering design process very helpful as a guide to STEM learning projects. So we're going to take a look first at how this helps our students. And notice in this model that the student is at the very center of this process. And that is really important because we want the student to be guiding this process, asking questions, and being a very active participant. And so when students are given the right support, it's amazing what types of leadership skills they can take on and the complex problems that they can complete. And so I will share some of the experiences I've had. And I know that just from getting to know who's in the audience, we have many secondary teachers. And I am working again with primary students, but it's quite amazing what my primary students can accomplish. So I'm sure that you're seeing lots of things at the secondary level as well. So as we kind of walk through this, the first part is to identify the problem and then clearly state it for the entire class or the small group to study. This is very important because we want to keep going back to that problem. So we make sure that when we're doing our research and our planning that we're working toward a solution for the problem. And then it's also important to ask, find out from your students what questions do they have. Post those questions in a common area in the classroom so that you can reflect on those questions throughout the process. And then next, we want to lead students to research and looking at all different types of media. So there could be print resources such as in books, looking for videos, interviewing experts or scientists if you can bring experts into your classroom, whether it be in person or through using technology. That's always very helpful. And then we want to imagine the solutions to the problem. What could they be, and starting to formulate a plan on paper or using a computer model. These are things that are going to help our students when they're presented with a complex problem. So when they create a prototype, it could be something they're building right in the school using materials that they have, simple things that are found around school, cardboard, paper, and so forth, or a prototype that's on using a computer model. I know as our students get into the higher levels, they're doing 3D printing models. We have 3D printers at our secondary levels. They're using computer-assisted design. So all of those things can be incorporated. So once the plan is implemented, we want to test the plan and see what the results are and what improvements could be made. So it is something that students really sometimes struggle with. What I've noticed is, their frustration levels, or students don't want to fail. And throughout this with STEM and project-based learning, sometimes there are going to be frustrations and failures. So to recognize those and help students work through those things is very useful and beneficial as they continue through their learning. So depending on how much time is available in your class, you can decide whether students have time to kind of go through those final phases and revisit them, the building, the testing, and improving, and looking at their plan and seeing what modifications could be made. So we're going to take a look at also the concept of a makerspace. And this is something that our elementary, junior high, and high school are embarking on, creating a space. And at the elementary level, it's in the library, where students can feel comfortable exploring creative solutions to problems and just building things that out of common materials, or as you'll see a little bit later in the presentation, I will share some of the robotics and different technology resources that we have in this makerspace area for students to solve problems with. So it's a open-ended area that has what I do as the person who curates the activities here is I try to change them, keep some things that are the same, and then change them out probably on a monthly basis. So it continues to evolve as I learn more. And I guess what I should share is my training is as an educator. I am not a computer scientist. I am not an engineer. But throughout my studies and my working with students and other teachers have really got a passion for this and have spent a lot of time researching how I can bring these experiences to the students within my school. So now we're just going to take a little bit of time to look at project-based learning and how it gives us a context for creating these projects with our STEM principles. So the first part is to think about what skills what content standards do you want your students to be focusing on? Because that really is one of the most important things. What is it at the end that you hope your students can articulate, and what is it that you want them to accomplish with this project? So for instance, in math, if students needed to learn about the area or perimeter of objects or spaces, what could be some projects that would lead them to work hands-on with some materials, either in their classroom or in their community or in their home, so that those skills would become something that they could interact with. And I'm going to share a project a little bit later in the presentation that shows how some third graders were working with those two principles. So this, again, is the first step in the planning. Our next step is the driving question. And this, for some teachers and for students, can be challenging, because this is a very key component, and it serves a purpose for the students and for the teacher. For the teacher, it helps the teacher focus on the materials and the resources they're going to bring into the classroom. But for the student, it really should engage them and spark interest in the problem. So hope that's the goal of the question. It would be an open-ended topic that students are going to explore. So, as I shared, that we had a problem in our lunchroom, in our cafeteria, where we had a lot of food waste. And the way that we solved that was by creating our school compost project. But when you're thinking about what are some of the problems, some questions, some examples might be, why is science important? How does medicine help people? How does probability relate to games? So an open-ended question that students can explore and find lots of different ways to solve that problem. And any way that we can connect the learning to something that's happening in the students' real life definitely makes it more authentic and more meaningful for students. That is one of the things that I know I've made it my mission, is to help students recognize how school skills are relating to things that they will be doing in their life right now and even into the future, because sometimes that can be challenging. And I do believe that the STEM curriculum as well as project-based learning are two ways that can make connections to real life, and where students really feel like what they're doing in school is meaningful and will help them. We always want to listen to our students and give them opportunities to make choices in how they represent what they know. So this is a big part of project-based learning. Thinking about how will you facilitate letting students share their ideas in class? What choices will you give students when they're going to be creating a final product? So for instance, just simple things like if students are going to be making a presentation about their research and their findings, maybe students, some students may choose to create a video that they would share. Other students may feel very comfortable speaking in front of the class, so they prepare a verbal or oral presentation or a speech that they're going to share their findings, whereas another group may want to create a website or other type of multimedia presentation. So how do you build in these choices so that students have a different way that they can represent what they know? And then reflection is always a very big part of the learning process. And so many times in school, I know that it can be very fast-paced and we have a lot that we need to accomplish. Many times there are outside forces that are making decisions about some of the things that must take place in school. So building in time for reflection is important. How will students think about what they're working on, and also figure out what is it that they need support with, and how teachers can build in that feedback cycle for their students. So with any good project, it's important to get some constructive criticism and have opportunities to revise or make revisions to the plan. And this is directly related to the reflection and the thinking process that goes through. So again, I think I had shared earlier, there have been some chances where we could invite engineers and scientists into our school, and then those people can, they're professionals working in that career, and they can really give students some very specific feedback about their projects. That can't happen. It's not realistic to happen for every single project, but even if you can have, just a few times a year, or start making those connections in community, making community contacts, it really helps with this process. And then the last thing is there a way to make a public product? Is it something that your students would be able to create that they can share into a larger community besides just your classroom? And so there's many ways that we can look at different opportunities for students to share beyond the classroom. One of my other responsibilities is that I run my school's student-led news broadcasts. So sometimes we feature products and projects on our student news. One example of that, during our quarantine, we had a young first grader who spent a lot of time creating a video about how he packs a waste-free lunch, and he thinks about how every item that he's putting in his lunch could be reused. And that video was actually seen by a community organization, and we won an award for our school was called the Quarren Green Environmental Award. So sometimes you just never know the impact that things can have if they go beyond the walls of your classroom. So keeping that in mind. This here is the foundation for the skills that students are learning in the library, and it really helps with our STEM products. These are our STEM projects that we're working on. These are as you see, the ISTE standards for students. So this is something that I think about because my students it's kind of unique because I start teaching when they're 5 years old and then till they're 12 years old. So if they're staying at the school, I actually am helping build their skills for 7 years in the library. So that's different from when I was a classroom teacher. I have much more time, and I can think about how the skills build from year to year. So these are, again, just a foundation of skills that I want to make sure they have before they move on to the secondary level. So what I'd like to do at this point is take some time to just show some of the projects that have been completed by students and some of the challenges and STEM principles and thinking that they have gone into them. So this was a project that it's called the Sphero Lift Challenge, and they're actually using a small robot, if you haven't heard of it, that's called the Sphero. And Lyft is a driving service, a taxi service that I'm not sure if Lyft is if that's something that you've heard of before, but the whole concept for this is that students are going to use. Have you heard of Lyft?
Yeah, but we don't have it here. We used to have Uber.
Okay.
And now it's replaced by another service. Yeah.
Okay. So yes, Lyft is very similar to Uber, and so the students have they've seen if they've been driving around on the road, they have noticed that cars will have a little symbol in the window that says it's a Lyft vehicle. So they may have had a family member that's used the service. So their job was to create a vehicle that could be powered with the robot. And they had just some very basic materials, a cup, some, craft sticks, some tape. And so they were thinking about different ways that they could use this vehicle to pick up passengers. So we were using Lego minifigures as our passengers, and the students had to go through different trial and error. So when they went through, you can see the drop-off zone. They had to start in a certain area and drop off their passengers in another area. And they were timing how long it took to pick up the passengers and transport them to the drop-off area. They were also keeping track of how many passengers safely made it to the drop zone area. And as you can imagine, it caused a lot of excitement, and there was lots of laughter and collaboration. So they had to work together with a partner, and they were using a program on our iPad that would put together how the Sphero robot would motor the car to pick up the passengers. And so this was building in lots of different ways for them to, that whole process of design, build, test, and then improve. You would notice many students running back to the table to make modifications to their vehicle. They were taking parts off, they were adding parts on. Sometimes they were watching other groups to see what success they were having. It didn't always relate to the vehicle that they had built, because many times it also came down to their driving abilities and how their program was working, because no matter how great they built their structure, if they didn't drive it properly, then it still wasn't picking up their passengers. So again, this is just one example of how you could use some very basic materials and create a challenge for your students to use those principles. Another very big portion of the curriculum in the Media Center is looking at computer science principles and coding. And so I'm pretty confident you've heard of Code.org. That is one of the resources that we use, and that was a resource that I know I had shared, and I think John McCarthy was passing those on, but I can share at the end some of the resources. This is just a way to really start our students, as I said, at even the youngest ages, 5 or 6 years old, thinking about how to break down a problem into step-by-step little pieces to get to the end result. So it really leads to logical thinking. They can look at all different parts of their lives and break it down into simple algorithms. And so we talk about how any process, just even making breakfast or the process of getting themselves to the bus stop to get picked up by the bus to get to school, we can break those down into simple steps. And and that's how the computer breaks down a problem and to create a program that can be used. So this is a very big part of what the students, when they come to the library, are learning about. The wonderful thing about Code.org is that all of the resources here are free. Another thing that really helps is that it's self-paced. So when we transition to our at-home learning, this part of our curriculum didn't have to stop. Students could continue logging in at home, and they could move at a pace that was comfortable for them. And if they needed support, they could reach out to me and I could help them. Many times they could also reach out to siblings, parents, and they could work together. So there's online as well as unplugged lessons that students can participate in. The resources continue to be updated every year. It's very simple to follow from a teacher's perspective. Our schools are using this from our elementary all the way into our high school. So you see here is like a screenshot of computer science and algebra. So our algebra classes in high school are also using these resources and have found it to be very, very effective in helping students, again, with critical thinking and breaking down problems and seeing how this relates to, if they see a problem, maybe they might start thinking of how they could create a simple app that would solve that problem and so forth. Through Code.org, you can actually be connected with local scientists and invite them into your school. So that was a really interesting experience for our students when they had a scientist visit and talk about how she got started with computer science, how it has evolved in her life and in her career to date. And so she was sharing some of the travel that she's done as a result of her job. This was just some comments of some of the students that were a part of her presentation, and as they were sending her thank you notes for coming to visit our school. So again, it's very comprehensive as far as the curriculum that's there and then the connections you can make with your community. So as I stated, some of the lessons are unplugged, meaning you don't need any technology to implement the lessons, and you can use simple things. These were some models that students were building just using some basic straws and some connectors, which are called straw bees. Many of the students actually find the unplugged lessons to be the most engaging. This is just a simple dice activity that they were working on, some probability, because it gets them talking and working with other people and sometimes building things. They have lots of different suggestions for building materials. So I have found it to be very helpful and very useful. Last year was kind of an exciting year for our district because we were given a grant, and the grant was able to purchase 4 different mobile coding labs. I forget exactly the dollar amount, it doesn't matter. But what we found was one of the things that was really important is we wanted to promote equity and make sure that all of our students had access to the same opportunities. And what we were noticing in our district, I work in a quite a large district for Michigan, where it's the 2nd largest district in Michigan. And so we have some schools that are serving more of a low income population. And so some of those schools didn't have access to the same robotics materials and learning opportunities. So what Project Code did is it brought into our school mobile coding labs. And so this is just a picture of when they first arrived. These carts can be transported by our wonderful support staff within our district, and they move from every school. And so you have them for about 6 to 8 weeks, and then the mobile coding lab moves on to the next school. So it was a way for us, again, to ensure the equity so that each student would be exposed to the same learning opportunities. And not just for the students, it was also for the teachers, because if teachers don't have these materials, they're also not learning these skills, and they're not able to bring these experiences to their children. So it was kind of disappointing that our school year was cut short, because that did mean that a couple of the schools did not get to participate in Project Code. But the good news is that we have these we have them as long as they're still working. So we will be able to continue sending our mobile coding labs from school to school once we get back to face-to-face learning. So this was something that I learned about the organization that gave the grant by going to a class that was on a Saturday morning, and then brought the idea back to our district. So it was something that we were very proud that we were able to get in place, because it definitely made a big difference. There are so many projects. This, just switching gears a little bit, this is actually not a project that I was able to implement, but one that I learned about on the project-based learning pblworks.org website. Quite fascinating, because students are looking at how they could design and build a tiny house. It's called the Tiny House Project, and it takes place in a 3rd grade classroom, actually in California, where they are building tiny houses in their community. So this is something, again, we talk about the community connections. This is something that students would actually see right out and about when they are going into their community. So the students were interviewing a client, if they had other teachers in the school coming in, and they were making changes and making plans. They actually had an architect visit their classroom and show them real floor plans, and then they would present their final design. And the way that students were creating these models was by using the education version of Minecraft, which is just an awesome way to promote creativity and really give a game-based way to replicate a real-world problem right in the school. This past year, when we went to remote learning, my principal at my school actually gave a challenge to some high school students. He supplied them with a floor plan of all the classrooms at our elementary school. And then the high school students used Minecraft to replicate our school, every aspect of our school, our gymnasium, our library, each and every classroom. And they really took time to try to make it look as close to the real thing as possible. And then our goal is, so that was right at the end of the year, they completed the task. Our goal is that as we start our remote learning this fall, that we are going to invite our students to be able to meet in this virtual learning space on Minecraft where we have now our Dresden Elementary School created. So just a great way of cross-learning, incorporating, getting some high school students that are creating a project for the younger students. So definitely a great resource to explore. This is another concept, using just the surroundings around your school and in nature to create a STEM walk. And there's actually a site that will give you some very specific steps, and they actually highlight other STEM walks that have been created by other educators. So you're using local spaces in the neighborhood around your school or at parks or right within your own school. And what this is recommending is that you have a minimum of 3 stops, that you can add more than 3, but you definitely choose 3. And each time you plan that stop in advance, you're going to give some questions that are going to guide students to examine the nature in that spot that you're stopping, or whatever has been built in the environment in that space. So it's just a way to promote inquiry and collaboration. And the final process is that students and their teacher will take, you can make drawings of the stops along the STEM walk. You could take pictures if you're bringing a device that can take pictures like an iPad or a mobile phone. Students can create notes or sketch notes. So it's a way, again, to bring that learning process, and it can be used for students of all ages. One other part of our project code was to bring in this small robot called an AzerBot. And so the AzerBot is a great way when young students are learning to code, because you can use simple things like actually the way the AzerBot is programmed, it can use a marker. And so the students are learning to draw simple code you see in that picture, like the green and the red marks. That's going to tell that robot to either turn or speed up or slow down. But they can also use block coding on the computer, and then the code, they just hold the robot right to the computer screen. It will upload the code, and then they can put it on the table or any surface on the floor, and then that code will run so they can see visibly how they're, I think that one thing that's the best with the robots is different than code.org. They can actually see their program come to life and whether it worked or not. So it promotes a lot of trial and error. The MicroBit is another way that we've incorporated STEM principles into the library. This is just a very small microprocessor, but can do lots of interesting things. So this young gentleman here actually programmed his MicroBit to keep track of how many steps he was taking around the library. And so when we think about like STEM and project-based learning, what happened is other students used the MicroBit to create their step counter. We started to compare, do I take as many steps around the library as the student? Do students were comparing how many steps they take? They were looking at their pace. And so it's very open-ended, and the students can create their own programs, or they can go online and look at some of the projects that the MicroBit website has put together for them. Instructables is another web resource that's giving, again, very specific instructions on how to use basic materials all the way up to using 3D printers and other resources that you might have. The bank there it's counting your money, and that's using a makey, which is very simple. It's just a matter of some wires and connecting them. We have those available also in our library, so students can, for instance, they can play the piano using common fruits and vegetables that they might have brought back from the cafeteria, from connecting them to the wires and then connecting them to the computer. This project here at this web resource is telling them how they have to just touch the coin to the small little wire that's above it, and it's going to be keeping track of how much money they're putting in their bank. So there's just an endless resource here of all different types of projects, again, for all different levels of learners. Genius Hour is another topic that you may call it something different, but the whole concept is that the students are at the center, and they're getting to choose a topic that they're passionate about and interested in. And so as the teacher, you're setting aside a time when they know it's best if it can be done on at least a weekly basis. I have done this in the past with I run our academically gifted and talented club that goes after school. So we do Genius Hour in that. It's challenging for me to do something like this in the media center since I'm only seeing the students once per week when they come to the library. But I have found with my ATG students, this is something that really keeps them focused. They work on it for an entire school year. And again, the topics can be very diverse, but this again is a way to incorporate projects in STEM, but also by asking the students what they're interested in. Many times when I'm just amazed at how willing students will be to go and do extra work. I heard that at the end of the last presenter where students are actually asking to either stay in during their break for recess or to work after school or they work at home. And I think when we can tap into their passions and their interests, that really definitely makes a huge difference. So you might be thinking, how to get started? What is the best way to get something going? And what I recommend is to choose a project that you already have in place that you feel confident with, that is working with your students, and then add on some of these elements. It's not necessary to start, completely new and start with a complete fresh project, but also really think about what learning standards. And many times with a project-based approach in STEM learning, you can combine multiple standards. So you can think about, what communication skills are students going to be learning in conjunction with their science and technology and math skills. If there are ways to connect with your community, it's great to start making those connections. And also think about interviewing your students. And that kind of goes with the Genius Hour to find out what problems are they noticing, what things are they passionate about, and how would those connect with the curriculum in your classroom. And I don't know if we have time to look. Let's see. I know is there another presenter coming on right after me?
No, we do have time. We have about 10 minutes. It's all right.
Okay. So I don't know if I should stop for some questions or if it's interesting to look at some of the web resources so they can, participants can see what they look like instead of just seeing them in the presentation.
The participants are asking whether this presentation will be shared with them.
I can make this, yes, available. I didn't do that, but I noticed the last presenter, that is a very good idea. So what is the best way for me to?
If you could send it to Mr. McCarthy and then he'll just forward it. We'll make sure everyone gets it. Okay.
Yes, I can definitely do that. And I remember the last presenter you did ask for email. So I'm definitely available through email at any time. We're just, I think 10 hours apart, correct?
It's almost 10 a.m. now.
Yeah, so for me, it's almost, it's going on 12 a.m. in Michigan.
Wow.
All right. So
we've got a few questions in the Q&A session. So the first question is, what kind of projects were in high demand among students or the most popular among students?
From what I have found, and again, I'm working with primary students. My students, they go crazy for anything that they can build hands-on, with their own hands. I think that is something that may be lacking in some of the projects that we're doing at school, but I have a very good relationship with the custodians, that are in the school. So I collect lots of cardboard. One of the projects that we did where the students were using just cardboard boxes in their imagination, and then they were making presentations, and we based it on a book that we read. It was called Not a Box. And so that was a really neat project because the students had very basic materials, but what made it so interesting was how they were envisioning and imagining things and how they had to share that with their classmates. So I find that the two things that are the most popular are when they can actually build something hands-on. using simple materials so that they have a tangible artifact that they can either take with them or share with someone else. And then also using the robots in any sort of, like the Sphero Lift Challenge was very exciting. There was another one where they would build, in Michigan, we get a lot of snow. And so they could build a snow plow, and the Sphero robot also floats. But we didn't actually get to do those other ones, but they were really looking forward to programming the robot again and seeing if they could take the knowledge that they learned with the Sphero Lift Challenge and improve on that.
Thank you. I'm going to combine a few questions because they're a little bit similar. So the project-based learning, is it done as part of the curriculum, or is it done as an extracurricular activity? And the follow-up is, who designs the criteria for assessment? How do you assess the projects?
Yes, so right now in our district, the project-based learning, and STEM is something that is coming from our central office, and that's a priority that they have. But when it comes to designing some of the projects, our teachers are working in teams to design projects that can be shared at a district, across the district. But a lot of times it is a passionate teacher that is willing to take the extra time to go, to make those community connections and create the projects. But we're really hoping to get it on a larger scale. What I do notice in the connections that I make with our secondary school teachers is some of those programs are much more established and elaborate. So there seems to be more going on at the secondary level than at the elementary. But I don't have as much hands-on experience with that. Now, when it comes to assessment, what works best is if you have some sort of either a rubric or, the expectations are shared with students before the project starts so they understand what the parameters are. So some projects can be done in my media center in the library. Some can be done just for the sake of the experience and the joy of learning, and it doesn't have to be attached to a grade per se that's going to go onto the report card. But for teachers that are working through this in their science classrooms and in their math classrooms, most of those teachers are giving students a rubric that will explain the criteria, how it connects to their standards, and then how they would take that project and translate it into a grade. And sometimes, as I said, if you're looking at multiple content standards, it could be something, if you're spending many days or weeks working on it, that it might be multiple grades that students are receiving for one project.
Again, I'm going to combine the questions. So the first is, so the student prepares the project, presents it. What happens next? And the follow-up question is there a way to license or how in any way protect the creative work that is done by the kids?
That's a really good question. And sometimes, some of the projects that is the end is just the presentation, but other times, as I shared with the compost project, it goes into a larger entity. We also had students in the past year, actually for quite a few, probably like the last 3 or 4 years, that have done some fundraising, and then they research charitable organizations, and those organizations come to the school. So they have to persuade their classmates where they should take the money that they raised and which charitable organizations they're going to donate it to. And then that organization comes to the school and they present the money that they've raised, and that organization can share their mission and their focus with the students. So sometimes it has a much larger focus. As far as taking the projects, I think, when you're thinking about, especially students that are working on bigger projects at the high school level, we had a young woman who created an app, and she was a high school student. She did this. She was just very passionate about it, spent a lot of time over the summer, but it was a way to, if students downloaded the app on their phone, and she wanted to encourage students to come to school, they could receive like bonus points for the more time that they spent at school and different activities that they did. And then those the point system that they were getting, it could translate to maybe getting something at the school store or a privilege at the high school that they wanted. So that student went through the whole process to get her app. It was available to download on iOS devices, and she was also adapting it so it could be downloaded on Android devices. So sometimes you could take your whole entire idea and model and prototype and take it to the whole development phase and have it go public. So there's all different ways to do that. But, looking at a Creative Commons license or creating a web presence. So it really just depends from the students, what their ambition is and how far the teacher wants to take it.
Yeah, once we did a project, the students composed and wrote a song as part of their English class. And they came up with this idea to protect it. And so we went as far as the Ministry of Justice, and we filed all the necessary documents and applications, and almost got it protected, because it's the procedure is too hard to protect the song, and it requires some finances as well.
Yes,
currently.
right.
But
Sometimes
the students still got a lot of experience from that.
Yes.
And the last question is, how different is the assessment of individual projects as compared to group projects?
Yes, that can sometimes be challenging because there has to be some accountability, and you have to have built in a system to have either through your own conversations with students and interviewing them to figure out exactly what parts of the project each student was responsible for. My experience has been when you meet with a group of students that sometimes, they can be very honest about it. But one way to approach that is to give students roles and responsibilities so that they have specific tasks that they're responsible for in the larger part of the group project. So again, finding that balance between the two, because I do really believe that learning those communication skills, collaborative skills, learning how to make compromises, that it's not always going to be your idea that is taken to the final stages. Those are really important skills to learn, because that's what we have to deal with when we're working with other people as adults. So those skills are important, but then it can present challenges for the teacher when you're looking at assigning individual grades. So I think the more open you can be with having conversations with the team members and having them document the different parts of the project that they contributed to, whether that be in writing or if you want to, sometimes online tools, if you're using a Google Doc, or we have Office 365 tools in our school, you can actually see through the technology, you can see when students who's contributing, what time they've contributed things. So there can be a trail of evidence as far as what people, what participants in the group have created. But if that's not the case, then you do have to rely on making your best judgments and, listening to the students as to what they contributed.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have no further questions from the audience. So Cheryl, I would like to thank you on behalf of all the participants. Lots of information. So that's why people are asking for the presentation, just to slowly go through the slides again.
Sure.
So we'll see you again later this week. So enjoy your night.
Thank you.
Thank you for staying up so late to join us.
No problem. Thank you, and enjoy your day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.